Hey, review buddy. My guest today is Professor Mollie Gerver, and we're going to talk about nudges and consent. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so before we get into your paper, why don't you explain what nudges are?
Great. So the concept of nudge is defined differently by different people, but the way we understand a nudge is any case where one person or an organization or a government tries to get an individual to make a specific decision, but doesn't use any coercion, doesn't give them any incentives to encourage them to make the decision, doesn't give them new information, which would encourage them to make that decision, and doesn't even encourage them to make the decision in any way. They just present the options in such a way that people are more likely to make that decision. So, a classic example of a nudge and an uncontroversial example, and that everyone views this as a nudge, is where the government says, we're going to make it so if you die, we'll use your organs to save someone if the organs are viable. But you can opt out anytime. And opting out is really easy. You just quickly go to a website and tick a box, or maybe you don't even have to do that. Maybe when you sign up for a general practitioner or a clinic, a medical clinic, maybe when you sign up, you're automatically put down to donate your organs if you die, but you can just check a box right there in the clinic saying you don't want to do that. So that's a nudge, because studies have found that when you make some option a default, in some settings, people are more likely to select that default than if you don't make an option a default. Now, a lot of the studies have been found not to be replicated. So it could be that a lot of defaults don't actually work. But when they work, then that would be a nudge.
Yeah, I remember when the book came out, the cover of the book was, I think, like this mama elephant kind of like pushing the baby elephant or something like that, right? So there's an element of paternalism here, right? It's like, we want you to make decisions that are good for you, but we're not going to force you to do those things. So we're just going to present the options in a way that kind of utilizes our understanding of psychology and the human mind so that you are encouraged to make the right choice. And the example that I really like is presenting food in a particular way such that you're encouraged to pick the more healthy food,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So I think the concept is interesting. It still respects your freedom, but it also encourages you to do the right thing.
Yeah.
I think one of the controversial parts of nudges is that people aren't aware that they're being nudged. I think there is this element of perhaps the government is manipulating us by exploiting our psychological weaknesses. Yeah, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that knowledge about being nudged is necessary for your decision to be free. And that's just because, regardless of how the government presents options, that presentation is going to impact what you choose. So imagine, here's an example. This has to do with the charitable sector. So charities, when they're asking you to donate money, they almost always put some amount as the default. So they'll say, well, do you want to donate $5 or $10 or $20 or $30? Here's the options. And you can choose one of those, or you can opt out and choose something else. Sometimes they'll even already click one of those options for you, and they are nudging you. But if they weren't to do that, if they were just going to say, pick any number, we're not going to give you any default, they're also presenting you a question in a way that impacts how much you donate. You'll perhaps donate less than if you were to be given a default. So the lack of a default also impacts what you choose. So you can't escape choice architecture. So nudges are when an organization or person puts you in a position where you're more likely to choose a specific option. But choice architecture is just the way options are presented to us. And if someone asks you a question, there's going to be some way they're presenting it to you. And we don't want to say all ways of presenting people options are wrong. You could claim that if they're presenting options in a way and you're not aware that the presentation impacts your choice, but if you were to be aware of that, you would have chosen something differently, then that information is relevant for you as to what choice you're making. And so your choice isn't informed. And so you haven't given informed consent. That's possible. But I'm not sure that all information necessarily has to be disclosed to people when you're obtaining informed consent. So I haven't thought about this that much. I'll be honest, this is a new topic for me. But yeah, your view about what information has to be given to someone to obtain their informed consent might impact whether or not knowledge about being nudged is relevant, is information you have to give people to determine whether or not their consent is informed.
Yeah, I like the point that you make when you say that we can't help but kind of affect other people's choices. Like just giving you any sort of option is going to affect your choice, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's an interesting distinction to make here between choices that benefit the other party versus choices that benefit you, right? The way that I traditionally understand nudges is that it's paternalistic. So the goal is for you to make good decisions for you, right? And an example that wouldn't necessarily align with that is the way that some restaurants present tips amounts. Like maybe they'll highlight, oh, do you want to give a 15% tip or a 20% tip or 25% tip, right? The way that they're presenting you with the options. Whereas like if you don't want to tip at all, maybe there's like a smaller box at like the bottom. And so they're kind of using just like, I guess the weaknesses of the human mind to kind of get you to do what is good for them and their servers and not necessarily for you. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
So there's actually probably three different kinds of choice architecture. Two of them are nudges, and a third one might be called a sludge. So a sludge is where you present options in a way that someone chooses the option that's good for you and not good for them. But you also have nudges that aren't good for you, but it's not necessarily good for the person who's nudging you. It's not necessarily good for the person who's presenting options in a certain way. It's good for society. So the organ donation nudge, that's a classic nudge that's good for society, or donating to charity. If the charity puts an amount as the default, you might be more likely to donate. And then that will help people who need the help. And then there's just the nudges that are just good for you, which is like putting the healthy fruit salad at eye level in the cafeteria. That's good for you. Maybe it's also good for society if somehow everyone getting more vitamins decreases the burdens on national health services, but it's classically viewed as something that's good for you. So when it comes to sludges, there's likely a greater duty to inform people that they're being nudged, or at least ask people's consent to being nudged, and informing them what a nudge is in general, and then being like, are you okay with us nudging you? Yeah. Are you okay with us nudging you for our benefit? And you're like, yeah, I'm fine with that. And then when they nudge you, it's maybe not as much of a problem. But if they don't ask for your consent, they don't let you know they're being nudged, it could be wrong if it's the sort of decision for which you need to give your consent. And if knowledge about being nudged is the sort of information that you need to have before making an informed choice, before giving informed consent. I think most nudge, like sludges, when it comes to tipping, like you're being nudged. When they say the default is 5%, you do know you're being nudged. And I'm not sure you have a right not to be nudged for something as inconsequential as being nudged to give 5% as a tip, or 10% or 20 as opposed to 0 or whatever. But some substantial choices, I think you do need to be, you both need to be informed that you're being nudged. And I think you have a right not to be nudged if you really don't want to. So if you're deciding whether you would like to be resuscitated in the event that you need resuscitation. So imagine right now you're conscious and a medical professional asks you, do you want to sign this non-resuscitation form? And the default is to be non-resuscitated. And you look at the form and you can opt out, but you feel a little uncomfortable doing that. Maybe because you feel that if you were to be resuscitated, you would be a burden, maybe on your family or the health services, or you're just standing in front of a doctor and you feel, I don't want to say like pressure to sign, but the authority of the doctor plus the fact that you've already been put down for non-resuscitation means you feel a little uncomfortable opting out, you're essentially being at least partly nudged into signing this form. And if you don't want to be nudged, given how important that choice is, you should be able to not be nudged, or you shouldn't be nudged without your consent. That's certainly true if you don't realize you're being nudged, but even if you do realize you're being nudged, there's something wrongly manipulative about that. But for smaller choices, I'm not sure that it's important that you know you're nudged, or it's that important that you decide whether you're nudged.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue to your paper. So can you kind of summarize your paper and what the argument was and what the experiment was?
So we wanted to find out what happens when you ask people's consent to being nudged. So you ask them, do you want to be nudged? Now, asking if people consent to be nudged is different than nudging people in a way so that they're aware they're being nudged. So you could nudge someone and be like, hey, guys, you're actually being nudged right now. And people have done other experiments on that. So you could do something like say, do you want to donate an organ if you die? By the way, we're defaulting you to donating an organ, and you can always opt out. This is a nudge. Here's what a nudge is. Be aware you're being nudged. And then find out if the nudge works. That's not what we did. That's just making the nudge really transparent. And some people think, well, if the nudge is transparent, then you're protecting people's autonomy because they know they're being nudged. But that's not true, because some people know they're being nudged, like with the tip. You know you're being nudged, but you don't want to be nudged. So it doesn't necessarily protect your autonomy. So that's not what we did. And some people think that if you tell people after the fact that they've been nudged, like you don't make it transparent at the time, but afterwards you say, listen, by the way, you were nudged. We put this option as a default. We put this charitable donation as a default. We put organ donations as a default. We put non-resuscitation as a default. You chose that. It might be because we put it as a default. You've been nudged. Do you still want to keep the same decision? That's not what we did either, because if you do that, a lot of people won't change their decision, but it doesn't mean they would have chosen the same thing had they known they were nudged at the time. So we didn't want to just find out if people keep the same decision once they find out that they were nudged. What we wanted to do is find out what happens when you tell someone, this is a nudge. We'll explain to you what a nudge is in general, maybe with some examples like organ donations, non-resuscitation. And then we're going to ask you, do you consent to being nudged? Okay? So that's what we did. We asked 1,518 people, do you consent to being nudged? Some people consented to being nudged. Some people didn't. And then we nudged them all. And we gave them a nudge for a charitable donation. So we asked people if they would like to donate to a specific charity, and we gave them a list of hundreds of charities. They could click the charity they could potentially donate to and say how much they wanted to donate. It wasn't their own personal money. It was money from a potential lottery that they could win. So we said, you might win 20 pounds in a lottery. Of this amount of money, how much would you be willing to donate to one of these charities? Afterwards, we told people that they were nudged, whether or not they consented. And then we asked people, do you regret the amount of money you donated? And we also asked people, are you happy with the amount of money you donated? You said you would donate. And do you feel resentment about how we asked you to donate? And what we found that whether or not people consented to the nudge, either they consented or not, they were more likely to choose the default than alternatives. So the nudge essentially worked regardless of people, whether they consented or not. And this was quite promising in that when people did consent to being nudged, the nudge was still really effective. So asking for people's consent to being nudged doesn't mean the nudge doesn't work. It does still work. And we also found that when people didn't consent to being nudged and were still nudged, they were more likely to regret the donation. They were more likely to not be happy with how much they donated. And they were more likely to feel resentment about the donation amount. So it seems that if we think it's important to ask people's consent before we nudge them, at least for some types of choices, we can both respect autonomy by asking for consent, but still get the benefits of nudging in the context of charitable giving, the benefits being more likely to choose the default and hopefully increase charitable donations.
I find this experiment really interesting. I want to get a little more detail. So you were asking people over the internet to do
This
this?
was an online survey on Prolific.
Okay. So how did you nudge people? Just by having one charity as the default, or the amount of donation as the default?
So the amount of donation was the default. People could choose any charity they wanted. So they were first told, we would like to ask you to donate to a charity, or how much you would like to donate. And we're going to first ask you, which charity would you like to donate to? And you can also choose to donate 0 if you choose a charity but don't actually want to donate any money. And some people did that. So they first selected the charity. They were chosen based on the most popular charities in the UK, or charities that were recommended from the organization GiveWell. So they were either particularly effective according to the organization GiveWell, or very popular. So that wasn't nudged. They weren't nudged into donating a specific charity. We wanted to give people as much freedom to choose which charity they donated to. And then we said, the next slide was, we've put you for a default. Yeah, so they were saying, this is default. Do you want to opt out? So they could click right below if they wanted to opt out, and then just type in the alternative donation amount.
I see. Okay. So it wasn't that there were 3 boxes on the screen and then one box was highlighted. It was just there was one box that was highlighted and then like a small box in the bottom that allows them to
Actually,
opt
it's a
out.
little more complicated than that. We were also comparing different types of defaults because we were interested to know whether certain types of defaults are more effective than others. So some people were given a number of options to choose from, and then they could unclick one option and choose and click another option. Some people were just told, we've put you down to donate this amount. Do you want to opt out? And then you opt out and type in another amount. And we found that it was for both types of nudges. They were effective even when people consented to being nudged. And when people didn't consent for both types of nudges, people felt more resentment and regret and unhappiness as a result.
How much was the lottery that they hypothetically could have won?
I want to say £20, but I have to double check because
Oh, okay. No,
we can
that's okay.
a bunch of experiments varying the lottery amount. By the way, the default was £2 for everyone. I think
The default donation was £2?
it was £2. The lottery was for £10. I said 20.
Oh, okay. So it was really little. I when you say lottery, I'm thinking like millions
No,
of
it's not
dollars.
millions.
Okay.
You can't afford that kind of money, but it could be that people would give very different decisions if they were given more money. It could be they would choose differently if it was their own personal money. It could be they would choose differently if we were all giving people money and not just running people on lotteries. So in the future, we hope to conduct an experiment where it's not just lottery amounts.
It would be interesting to conduct another experiment in which everything is exactly the same, but there is no nudge.
We are currently collecting respondents for just that, where we have 13 different treatment groups, and we include a control of a non-nudge group. And we also include people that have been consented. We have a group where we ask people, do you consent? And if they consent, we nudge them. And if they don't consent, we don't nudge them. So that's one group. And then we have another group where they consent, we nudge them. If they don't consent, we also nudge them. And we hypothesize that there's no significant difference in the donations between the two groups. And that would be important because if there's no difference between the two groups, you might as well just ask people if they consent to being nudged and only nudge them if they do consent. So we're right now, the final respondent should actually be submitting today. And we're also going to see whether or not the group where we listen to them, we only nudge them if they consent, whether that group still donates more money than a control group that isn't nudged at all. So in this particular experiment, we didn't do that. It was essentially a pilot without a control group. So it was not a proper pure experiment.
Interesting.
We didn't randomize. There was no randomization involved.
Okay. And just so the audience knows, today is July 19th, 2024. Okay. So what did you find most interesting about this experiment?
I think the most interesting for me was whether or not people regretted their donation amount. So I think in general, and this is controversial in philosophy, that how you treat someone should partly be based on whether or not they're going to regret how they were treated, and whether or not you treat someone in a certain way based on whether they consented to be treated that way, or whether you take their money because they consented to have their money taken. Whether that consent actually gives you permission to take their money is dependent on whether they're going to feel regret about what you've done. Now, it's not the only important consideration. If someone donates a lot to charity and you're pretty sure they're going to regret their choice, it could still be okay because the money will go to an important cause. But if it's not that much money and not such an important cause, and you think they're probably going to regret giving you the money, you have good reason not to take the money. And that's because if they're going to feel regret about the decision they made, then afterwards, when they feel that regret, they're going to feel like they're living with a choice that is not a choice they endorse. They're living a life where they're living with something that is not the thing they want. Their lives aren't going the way they want them to go. They'd rather live a life where they didn't donate that money in the past and they had the money in their pockets. And so in one small way, they're less the author of their lives than if they donate the money and they're really happy they donated it and they feel like, yeah, that donation aligns with my values. I'm happy I did it. I'm happy I'm living a life where I donated that money. Their autonomy is stronger in one sense if they don't feel that regret. So if it turns out that nudging people without their consent leads them to regret the choice they made, then we should be concerned about that. That could be one reason not to nudge people. But if it turns out we can nudge people with their consent, and then they don't regret their choice, or they're less likely to regret their choice, then we've protected people's long-term autonomy, at least in one sense. And if it also turns out that nudges are just as effective when we ask people for consent and they don't regret their choice, then we might as well ask people if they consent before nudging them.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there would be any cost to ask them for their consent.
Yeah. It could be. I mean, we'll see in this other experiment we're doing whether there is a cost. To find out if there's a cost, you really do need to have a number of control groups, which we will have in this larger experiment. You need to have a group where some people are listened to. You only nudge them if they consent and you don't nudge them if you don't. And compare that to a group where just everybody is nudged and you ignore their consent, or you don't even ask them for consent at all, which is one group. It could turn out that if you don't ask people, you just ignore consent, or you don't ask people for consent, they really do donate more money. And maybe they feel more regret, but they end up contributing greater amounts. Then there would be a cost. So we're hoping there's no cost, but there may ultimately be a cost.
So when you asked the group that was not asked for consent, they said that they were regretful? Did they say that they regretted their decision or that they were just less happy?
In this experiment, both of those things. In this experiment, everyone was asked if they consent. It's just that everyone is asked if they consent. Some people didn't consent, but we still nudged everybody. And those who didn't consent were nudged because everyone was nudged. And they were more likely to feel regret. And they were also less likely to be happy with their donation amount.
I see. Yeah. Okay. So there was one group that was nudged anyway, even though they said they did not consent.
Yeah. So all groups were nudged.
Yeah.
In this new experiment, we're going to end up having some groups not nudged.
Yeah. So then I wonder if the reason why they regret their decision is because you ignored the fact that they did not give their consent to be nudged.
Yes. So that's what we think might be going on. So it's two things could be going on. It could be they regret their decision because they never consented to being nudged. They said, I don't want to be nudged, and they were consented anyways. And the fact that we ignored their consent is the reason they rejected their decision. They regretted their decision. And that's a reason I think not to nudge people without their consent. It could also be that they would have regretted their decision anyways. It could be the kind of people who don't consent to being nudged are the kind of people who regret their donation amounts. And the reason they feel regret is not because they were nudged without consent. It's just because they're the kind of people who feel regret. We'll find that out in this other experiment because of all the additional control groups.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So the people that said that they regretted their decision, did you ask them, like, if they would rather donate a smaller amount, or if they would just rather not donate, have not donated anything.
We asked them if they wanted to donate a smaller amount after telling them that they've been nudged against their consent. And there was no significant difference in the donation amount once we told them you've been nudged, which is interesting because people are more likely to feel regret about the donation, less happy about the donation, but they're not more likely to change their donation. And that could be just because once you've given a donation, you don't want to take it back. In some ways, you can't escape the nudge. Like you've already put down £5, £2, £10. You don't feel comfortable taking that away. That could be what's happening. It could be that they feel regret, they're not happy, but maybe if they hadn't been nudged, they would have actually donated the same amount anyways. And what they were feeling regret about, as you said a moment ago, was just the fact that they were nudged, not the donation amount.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's an interesting psychological dynamic going on, right? It's like you regret this decision, but you wouldn't change it anyway. It's like, I regret giving that $5, but I'm not gonna, change my donation amount. So it's just like, oh, I would feel bad. Because I just donated $5 to orphans. Am I going to be the person who takes $5 away now from this orphanage? I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. If there's no cost to getting people's consent to being nudged, then I don't see any reason why we wouldn't ask people's consent to being nudged. But then here, I guess if you're a pro-nudge person, how important do you think it would be then at that point, right?
If there's no cost.
Yeah, one is like there's no cost, and two, it doesn't really change the outcome. Let's say it doesn't actually change the outcome, right? Then how important do you think it would be to get people's consent to be nudged, given that your choices are going to be influenced no matter what?
Yeah. So like I said earlier, your choice will be influenced no matter what. So why do you even have to get people's consent? So I think that when it comes to nudges that are for other people's benefit, so that's charitable giving or a tip, it seems like people should be informed more than if it's an action that's for your own benefit, assuming we're not talking about like a bodily intervention. Like you should be just informed about surgery, if not more informed about surgery than about donating a couple bucks to a charity. But if it's something that you're getting people to do for someone else, it seems that people should either be informed that they're being nudged or not nudged if they don't want to be nudged. And that's because I said this earlier, like if it's something you need their informed consent for, and it's an important enough decision, and it turns out that one really important piece of information that people care about, and that people care about, it doesn't impact their decision, but people care about when deciding whether or not to donate money, is whether they're nudged, then that's information that is relevant for giving informed consent. And that's true even if the information has no impact on their decision. So in general, when it comes to the kind of information we care about in informed consent, when it comes to deciding what we tell people when they give consent, it matters whether what we tell people will impact whether they consent, but it also just matters whether or not the information we give people goes into the decision-making when they consent. So for example, imagine that you're deciding whether or not to accept some type of surgery. And when you're making the decision of whether to accept the surgery, you're thinking about what the risks of the surgery are. So you're thinking there's a 50% risk the surgery won't be effective. And you're thinking about that 50% risk, and you decide 50% risk is a risk that I would accept. And so you consent to surgery, okay? Now, it could be that it's actually not a 50% risk. It's actually 80% risk. And it could be that if you knew it was an 80% risk, you would still consent to the surgery. But you should still have a right to know that it's a 50% risk, because when you're making the decision, you're making the choice, I consent to surgery with 50% risk. If it turns out there's 80% risk, you haven't consented to surgery with 80% risk. You've only consented to another kind of surgery with other kinds of attributes. So it's not informed consent if you're lied about the risks, even if you would have accepted the surgery regardless. So I think there might be something similar going on when it comes to knowledge about being nudged. People want to know, in some contexts, whether they're being nudged when they donate to charity. Maybe they don't actually. But if people want to know that they're being nudged when donating to charity, they think it's an important fact that goes into their deliberation when determining how much they donate or whether they donate at all. And you're not telling people they're being nudged. And they donate to charity. They might say, listen, I maybe would have donated the same amount to the same charity, but I only consented to donate money with the assumption I wasn't being nudged. And now you're telling me I'm donating money while being nudged. I haven't consented to a donation while being nudged. Now, maybe people don't care that much, in which case there's just so little harm in nudging people that you might as well just do it. But if they do care a great deal, then that seems like something they should either know about or not know they're being nudged, but at least consent to a donation request with a nudge.
Yeah. I feel like one distinction between that surgery case and perhaps like this charity case is that in the surgery case, you would be lied to, right? If the doctor said 50% chance, well, in fact, it was 80%.
Yeah.
So I think that's a little different. But I feel like if we want to get people's consent in order to be, to like rightfully and justifiably nudge them, then it would seem that we would always have to reveal the fact that they are being nudged in some way, right? Because if you can't help but influence their decision and we really care about getting their consent, then every single time people are being presented with some sort of choice or maybe not a choice, they have to be informed that they're being nudged, right? So for instance, I have a Patreon, right? And in Patreon, they allow different donation amounts and they have a feature where like one option is highlighted, right? And so when I was setting up my Patreon, I was thinking about nudges. I was like, do I want to nudge people for like the $5 one or like the $10 one? You know what I mean? I was thinking about this and I'm just like, and then, but if I really want to get people's consent, right, that means I have to, somewhere on this page, I have to say, by highlighting this, I am nudging you to select this option. You know what I mean? Whereas like, so I don't know if that is supposed to be the conclusion of this work. Because I feel like it would also be limited by your intention, right? Because if I'm behaving in a certain way and that influences other people's decisions, but my goal is not to nudge other people or influence their decisions, that perhaps there's no obligation or duty on my part to inform people that I'm doing that, right? So for instance, maybe there are 3 options on my Patreon page and I have the middle one that's highlighted. But the only reason why I have the middle one highlighted is because it just aesthetically looks better.
Okay.
But inadvertently I am nudging people to select the middle option. Right? So is that, am I nudging people? I'm unintentionally nudging people. But I know that I'm unintentionally nudging people. So even though I don't have the intent, I have the knowledge. So perhaps that still provides some reason for me to inform people that they're being nudged.
Yeah, I think there's still a reason, because we care about consent not only because we care about people not controlling other people. We do care about that, obviously. But we also care about consent because we care about people making decisions that they have control over. And if people are making a decision without being aware that they're nudged, and if it turns out awareness of being nudged goes into people's deliberation, it impacts either the final decision they make or they think that's information that's relevant for themselves when they're making the decision, then you're decreasing their autonomy compared to a situation where they're nudged while being aware they're nudged, or even better, they're nudged after having consented to being nudged. So I don't think it necessarily matters. It does matter. It could be worse if your intention is to get them to donate a specific amount. But as long as you can foresee that people are going to be impacted by these nudges, or you can foresee that people don't want to be nudged and are donating without having consented to being nudged, then I don't know if you've committed an all things considered wrong, but it would be better, given what you know about people caring about the nudge, for you to just give people a heads up by the way you're being nudged.
So I have a funny story about nudging. My dad used to own a pizza store, and we had like the pepper flake shaker and like the Parmesan cheese shaker. And my dad would always keep the Parmesan cheese shaker low because he thought that it would encourage people to use less of it.
Mm-hmm.
So he would save money that way, And I thought that was just so funny that he that he thought of that. It's like, I don't want people to like use too much Parmesan cheese, so I'm just gonna keep the shaker low.
Yeah.
But that's a nudge, right?
I don't know if that's a nudge, because if it depends why people are using less Parmesan. If they're using less Parmesan because they want to be polite, they don't want to use it up so that other people can have it, then they're trying to be nice, and there's a cost for them if they're not. There's a cost of politeness. Like there's a cost for other people in their mind. There's a cost for themselves because they don't want to be bad people. There's a cost for the shop, maybe the pizza shop, because they think the pizza shop might be running low on Parmesan. And so it's not a case where you're impacting their decision without penalizing them or other people. You're technically not, but people are responding to what they think is going to be a cost, like other people won't have enough Parmesan cheese. So I don't even think of that as a proper nudge.
Interesting.
Maybe it's
So
worse than a nudge because you're like misleading them, because you're making them think that there's less Parmesan cheese than there is. I doubt that's the kind of information people have a right to have. And you're also not like getting their consent for something. You're just offering them a gift of Parmesan or a service of Parmesan along with your pizza. So I don't know. So there's not like, there's no consent really going on here. Maybe there kind of is, because like you're taking people's money in return for the pizza, but I don't think of that as a proper nudge.
So are you saying that there has to be no cost to other people in order for it to count as a nudge?
Yeah. Because if there's
But what about the organ donation part?
So there's no cost. So if the reason you're donating the organ is because you don't want someone else to go without an organ if they need one, then that reason is not responding. That's not a nudge creating reason. The nudge creating reason is, I'm already on the default, I might as well just stick to it. There's multiple reasons you're probably keeping that checked on the default, but the nudge reason is, I'm already the default, whatever.
Okay. So for the Parmesan cheese example, it would only be a nudge if the reason why people are using less Parmesan cheese is simply because there's little of it in the shaker.
Yes. And that's a good question. So like, are there any real nudges? Like, even the default, it's like, well, it's a little bit of work to like tick the box, right? There's like some cost, and tiny little cost involved. But if the cost is just this heuristic, not a lot of Parmesan, okay, I'm just not going to take a lot. But it's not a lot of Parmesan, I want to leave enough for other people, then yes, that would be a proper nudge. If it's like a thoughtless, less Parmesan equals don't take Parmesan, nothing in between the less Parmesan and take less Parmesan reasoning, I would view that as a pure nudge.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that without actually asking people to do some introspection, I don't think we can ever know. But my intuition tells me is that it was just an automatic thing. They saw little Parmesan cheese, and so they just used less of it. It's not that, if I use it all, then the next customer won't have any. Because I think the assumption is that the pizza store is just going to have more in the back, right?
Well, you could actually run an experiment where you somehow find a way of reducing the politeness variable. Like, let's say one of the groups is told, we've got more Parmesan in the back, by the way, so there's enough for everyone, and they still were likely to use less Parmesan when there was less in the Parmesan dispenser, that's what it's called, then that would be evidence that it truly is the nudge itself. It truly is a nudge and not just responding to some sort of norm of politeness.
Yeah, that would be interesting, right? Like you tell the customer, oh, don't worry, we have more in the back. And then just still kind of observe their behavior. It's like, oh, there were still only 3 shakes for a slice
And their behavior, the heuristic, less Parmesan equals don't take, might be a heuristic we develop because typically when you see less Parmesan, it means there's less for other people. But as long as the heuristic is there and it doesn't go away, even when you tell people there's plenty of other Parmesan left, I'd call that a pure nudge.
Yeah, I think that is your next experiment.
Yeah.
Do the Parmesan cheese experiment.
Important. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's pretty fun to think about different experiments that we can conduct that may be nudges. So imagine a charity donation nudge, but instead of just presenting the different options, the way that you kind of nudge people to donate is to show them sad imagery of people suffering, right? And it's like, do you consent to seeing sad imagery of people suffering? And this is, like we have reason to believe that this is going to encourage you to donate more money.
Yeah.
Like, would that be a nudge?
Sad imagery? I don't think so, because the imagery is tapping into some emotion, and that emotion is something like, it's horrific what is happening, and I really ought to do more. It's reminding you about your obligations, and then you're going to be acting on those obligations. That feels like you're helping someone think through what it is they ought to do and not getting someone to make a decision using some simple heuristic. So the question is, what's the difference, I guess? I think that it's good to help people think through what their obligations are. And if the imagery helps them think through, then you're increasing their autonomy in some ways, assuming that an autonomous life is a life where you're making reasoned and thoughtful decisions. If the imagery doesn't do that, though, if it's just this immediate like emotion and you're not thinking at all and you're just pressing the donate money, then I have to think more. So if it's this punch in the face emotion, but that emotion is the appropriate emotion to have given the state of the world, but you never had that emotion because you're just not looking at these images, they're out of sight, out of mind, then I think the image does help you live a more autonomous life. You're responding to the reasons you had all along. But if it's not that, if it's like you're seeing the emotional images and you're donating, but that emotion is not tapping into some truth that you ought to be aware of, then it is kind of like nudging. I don't know if it's manipulation, but it feels like something you'd maybe have to get people's consent for.
Yeah, interesting. I'm not entirely sure how to define a nudge now. It sounds like we're saying that it can't tug on your heartstrings. Like that doesn't count as a nudge. It has to be something that's neutral emotionally almost.
Well, it can. I think it can. Yeah. So maybe I think it can tug on your heartstrings, but it can't tug on your heartstrings because your heart's responding, or your heart's responding in a way that's appropriate given the state of the world and given people's needs to obtain charity.
Okay, so what about this? Let's say instead of showing people suffering, we show like a dead flower, right? And let's say psychologically, for some reason, when human beings see a dead flower, they're more charitable.
Yeah.
Would that be a nudge?
If the dead flower evokes a sorrow and they feel sorrow for people that need resources, or that dead flower evokes a sense of solidarity with people who are in need of support, and you ought to feel that solidarity, you ought to feel that support, you ought to feel that sorrow. No, I don't think that's a nudge. I think that's kind of like using art to inspire activism and change. And I wouldn't view that as the kind of simple heuristic that is philosophically interesting. I mean, the other case is also philosophically interesting, but somehow I don't think that requires the same consent. But I have to think why that is. Like, why does it not? It does. For me, it doesn't require the same consent because it's increasing autonomy in the sense of giving you reasons that you already have, encouraging you to think about the reasons that you should do something, reasons that you objectively already have, if that makes sense. It's encouraging you to deliberate. It's encouraging you to make a more informed decision. That's not happening if the only reason you're donating is because there happens to be a default there.
Yeah. All right. So let's take it to the next level, like even more abstract. So instead of a dead flower, let's say it's just a color. But, colors evoke certain emotions.
Yeah, I think that's
right?
the same as like the flower case.
Interesting. Okay, so what if something's presented?
It could be a nudge if it's just like blue equals donate more money, or blue equals sorrow, sorrow equals leads you to donate more money, but you're not thinking about what you should be sorrowful about. You're just feeling sorrowful. And for some reason, when people feel sorrowful, they just tend to increase their contributions. That would feel a little more nudgy than if it's blue sorrow. I'm thinking about the people that need help. I really ought to help them. I'll increase my contributions.
Okay, so then what if the option for donations was, presented on the left side of the screen versus the right side of the screen, and people just tend to check boxes that are on the right side of the screen? That would be a nudge, right?
Yeah, that would be a nudge.
Right, because it has nothing to do with your. Well, I guess it's emotionally neutral, right? And it has nothing to do with the cause itself.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's think of another scenario. This is so fun. So let's say that you have different donation boxes, right? And the one that you want them to click on has like a cute puppy on it. Would that be a nudge?
So it depends on whether that puppy encourages you to think through the donation and all your reasons for and against donating that amount and that donation.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
My intuition is saying no.
that it's
People
not,
are just more likely to click on it because it's a cute puppy.
this is a cute puppy. Then yeah, that's enough. Is that a nudge? Let's think. I mean, they'd be like, aw. I'm just trying to like internalize that. Like what?
Yeah, and the charity has nothing to do with the welfare of animals.
Yeah, I assume that. But like people sometimes spontaneously buy a postcard with a cute puppy. We don't think of that as a nudge. And that's probably because they're getting to keep the postcard and they can benefit from the money they give. I guess with the water. I guess with the donation, it's like, yeah, you don't get to keep the puppy. You're not going to benefit from the cuteness. So why are you more likely to click it? But what about when people, I don't know if it's ever happened, but like dressing up as like a cute puppy to, let's say you have like a local fundraiser and someone's like dressing up in a cute puppy costume with like a bucket and asks like, can you donate? I wouldn't view that as a nudge. I'd view that as like, oh, a whimsical way to get people to donate money. So I'm trying to think what the difference is. I think there's some.
Is it because it's so obvious?
Well, yeah.
Where like nudges are almost secretive?
Yeah, like if someone just had, here's all the different donations, and then there's just like, there happens to be like a puppy in the corner, but you wouldn't notice that it was associated, but you click on the button that's close to the puppy. Yeah, that would be like, I don't even know what's happening. I'm being encouraged to donate something for a reason that I'm not even aware of and that I don't think is a good reason to donate. Yeah, that would be a nudge, and that would feel like you should ask people's consent beforehand or make people aware they're being nudged.
Yeah, so maybe it's the secretive part where it's just the non-obvious element that makes it more of a nudge.
Yeah, but what if
right? So let's
no?
let's say you have different donation options, and the one that you want them to choose is like sparkly. Like, well, people are going to see the sparkles, right? Like it's obvious that it's being highlighted. But let's say the other two options, they're flickering at a frequency that you can't visually see, but it negatively impacts the way that you view those boxes. And so you're more likely to pick the middle one.
Yeah, that feels like, that feels manipulative because I'm responding to a reason that is not a good reason.
Yeah, okay. So then,
know I'm doing like, it's okay to respond to use a reason that isn't a good reason, to respond to that reason. But if you don't even know that that's true, I have to think about this. I mean, but people do that all the time. Like we make all sorts of decisions in our lives that are for stupid reasons that we're not aware of. I don't want to say that whenever that happens, people are wronging us. But if they're intentionally doing that, like you were saying, it does feel different if it's intentional.
yeah, I think there's an intention element and there's like a secretive element too.
Yeah. And usually on work on manipulation, a necessary condition is that it's intended. So if it's intentional and secretive and you don't even know it's happening to you and you don't have a good reason to do it because it's not a nudge that helps you, maybe even if it's a nudge that does help you, but especially if it's for somebody else, that does feel like wrongful manipulation.
This is a really interesting topic, and I've really enjoyed this conversation.
That was really interesting. I really like that Parmesan anecdote. I'm going to think about that some more.